All right, give it up for Kyle.
Hey everyone, thanks again for coming out tonight. My name is Kyle. I'm an iOS engineer here at Lyft on Driver Labs. And this is actually my first time back in the office in 6 months. Feels good to be back, but I had a pretty bad ski accident 6 months ago. I broke my back. That's a story for another time. But during my recovery, I had a lot of time to explore this new API in iOS 13, context menus. And I wrote a blog post that was pretty popular. So I thought it would be fun to do sort of a live tech talk of that blog post, sort of. So let's talk about context menus. If you haven't seen them before, they're very similar to peek and pop on, I think, starting in iOS 10 or 11, when Force Touch first came out. And they allow you to show a menu to a user and even a preview for content. So this is an example from the Photos app from the Human Interface Guidelines. And just by long pressing or force pressing on a row in the collection view, or an item, sorry, you can see a bigger version of that photo and a menu to act on it without having to tap into the photo, look for those options. So as Apple says, it's something you should use to give people access to additional functionality related to your on-screen items without cluttering up the interface. So when I got invited to do this talk, I quickly posted this on Twitter. We'll see if I regret it. I quickly followed up with this. So you actually get 2 live coding demos today. We'll see how this goes. And with that, let's just dive right into it. Let me get out of here. Turn on mirroring. All right, so I'm not going to start building an app from scratch, of course, but I have a little demo app here. Let's take a look at what we have so far. So this is an app that'll suggest recipes for you. It's got a list of recipes. You can tap into one and see the ingredients. Don't look too closely because they're not real. And you've got a few options here for adding the ingredients to your shopping list, saving a recipe to one of your own lists, sharing it, disliking it to help the recommendation algorithm that totally exists. And it's not too useful on iPhone, but it'll be relevant later. We even have drag and drop. So on an iPad, I could drag this into another app and share the recipe with a friend. So that's a quick overview of what the app looks like. Here's some of the code. This recipes view controller is the view we were just looking at. It's got an array of recipes backing it, some table view setup, some private helper methods, drag and drop code. But let's just ignore that for now. And let's focus on adding context menus to our list here. So I've got a few to-dos here. And the first is to create a configuration with a menu. So what does that mean? Since we have a table view, the system already has methods that we just override to supply a context menu. And these methods are quite the mouthful, as usual with UIKit. But let's see if I can find one. You know that thing where somebody's looking over your shoulder and you forget how to type? Configuration for... Sorry. I think it's just context menu. Here it is. All right. So table view context menu configuration for row at index path and point. Quite the mouthful. And this method wants us to return a UI context menu configuration, or not. It's up to us. So I'll just return nil for now to silence the compiler warning. But let's take a look at what it takes to build up a configuration. So let config equal UI context menu configuration. And we've got quite a few arguments here, well, just 3. We've got an identifier, which we don't need to worry about for now, but we'll come back to. Just specify nil. A preview provider, we'll also come back to that. And an action provider. And preview provider and action provider, their types are actually aliases for closures or for functions. So if we press enter, it'll build that closure for us. And it takes in an array of UI menu element. We'll also ignore that for now, and returns a UI menu. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it takes to build a UI menu. It sounds promising since we're trying to build a menu. Let menu equal UI menu. And this has quite a few arguments: a title, an image, an identifier, some options, and some children. And these children are where you actually pass in the actions for your menu. So if you've ever used a alert controller, UI alert controller, to build an alert or an action sheet, it's actually a pretty similar API. And you build actions and then add them to the menu. And an action, the class for that is UI action. So to build an action, you need at least a title and a handler. You can also configure it with images, identifiers. Let's just start with share, for example, if we want to share a recipe. And I made a little wrapper around SF symbols, so I wouldn't have to remember those strings. UI, oh my gosh, sorry guys. UI image symbol dot share. We'll ignore identifier and all this other stuff for now. This is an option set. Also, actually don't need any of this. So let's just do a title and a handler. And this is where the action gets called when the user taps on it. So we'll print out share. And let's ignore all this for now as well. Promise we'll revisit it. And put our action in that menu. And then let's return that menu from this closure. And return that configuration in this table view method. And let's see what happens. So if we long press or force touch on a phone that has it, now we have a menu. And if we click on it, we print out share. So that's really all it takes to add a menu to your app if you have a table view or collection view. You just override this one method, make a configuration, and you can get actions getting called. And just to not waste too much time typing, I'll just skip ahead to the next step using Git. And here's our fleshed out configuration. We've got a share action with an image, one for saving the ingredients, one for disliking the recipe, and they all have images, and here's where those show up. And let's look at this dislike one. It's red. And that's where the attributes comes into play. If you specify destructive in the attributes, pretty similar again to UI alert controller, you'll get the red highlighting indicating that it's a destructive action. All right, so let's look at what's next on our to-do list. Our other, in the details for recipe, you can also add a to-do list to one of your own collections. So I don't actually really have lists to save it to, but let's say we had a list of lists. Maybe our user has a favorites list and one for saving desserts they really like. We can pretty easily make actions for this. Let list actions equal, we'll just map over these. What did I do? All right. UI action. I'm just going to use some shorthand to put the name of the list in the title. Save to that list. And we'll just print save. And we could add all these actions into our children, and they just show up in that list. But that would start getting really cluttered. Imagine the user has 10 different lists that they save recipes to. So you'll notice that these children, Xcode is not going to tell us that, of course, but the children is actually an array of UI menu element. And UI menu itself conforms to that protocol. So we can throw another menu inside this array of items. So let's build a submenu to put in here. So save to list menu. And we'll give this one a title because it'll actually use that title when the list is, when the menu is to show in the top level of the menu. Save to list. And these children will be the list actions. And if we toss that in here, then UIKit will give us a pretty nice submenu system. And if we tap on Save to List, oh, I got a nice typo there. You can save to favorites or save to desserts. And that way you don't clutter up your menu. But if there's only 2 items in your submenu, maybe it would be OK to put them in the top level. So you might add a conditional, and you can use this options set to specify a display inline option. And if you do that, UIKit will separate out the items in this menu from your other items with these nice dividers, but they'll still show up right here. So the user can quickly access them. So let's skip ahead just to make sure there's no more typos. And here's our fully implemented configuration with that save menu. So moving on to our third item on the to-do list, show detail and preview action. So if a user clicks on a row, it shows this nice detail view. And they'd probably think that they could do the same if they tapped on this preview. By default, it won't do anything. But we can pretty easily tap into that by overriding another method. We'll perform preview action for menu with configuration, UI context menu configuration, animator. All right, so we don't need to worry about the animator for now. But what we can do here is, or actually we do need to use the animator. We can add a completion block to the animator to show our detail view after the user has tapped on it and that pop animation happens. So let's go ahead and construct a recipe view controller for the single recipe. And that's just the one you see when you tap on a row. But here we actually need a recipe to pass in. And that's where the identifier of our configuration comes into play. Now, it might be tempting to pass in the index path. It's right there. We can use it to look up the recipe in this function. But that's a bad idea. You really want to avoid using index paths as identifiers, because the table view might shift underneath you while the menu is open. So instead, we're going to use the actual ID of the recipe. And that's a string. Unfortunately, Identifier has to conform to NS copying. And we could maybe create an NS string from that identifier and pass it in. But I went with another approach to sort of wrap it up nicely so we didn't have to cast back and forth every time we compare them. And it's just this little protocol, menu identifiable. It requires that your type supplies an ID, and then it creates a menu ID for you, just wrapping your ID in an NS string. And it has this helper method for checking if your item is referenced by a menu configuration, just by checking if the identifier is equal. And thanks to constrained extensions, we can extend an array where our element is menu identifiable and easily get the item for a configuration or the index for a configuration, which will be useful later. So here, all we have to do is, let's use a guard just in case this recipe is gone from our list. Guard let recipe equal recipes dot item for configuration. Else we'll just return. So now we have a recipe, throw it in that view controller, and we can add, this animator is a protocol, and it has a lot of the same methods that you see on like UI view property animator. So just like UI view property animator, we can add animations to it, to animate alongside it, or add a completion. So in our completion, we'll go ahead and show this recipe view controller. And if we go ahead and run that, we should be able to tap on that preview. And, oh, let's see, technical difficulties. You know what? Let's not waste our time. Here's the working version. I think I know what I did. I didn't actually pass in the identifier up here. But yeah, if we tap on this, we'll pop right into the details. So that's great, but honestly, this preview isn't all that useful. We could maybe just show the detail view right here when you press on it. But I think it would be great if we showed a larger version of this photo. Our designer, it was me, decided to make these thumbnails small so that you could quickly glance over and compare the ingredients and the times. It was actually just so this demo would work. So let's go ahead and provide a larger version of that photo for our preview. And we're going to move this up here because that actually uses the configuration yet again. That's where PreviewProvider comes into play. So this is also a closure that takes no arguments and returns an optional view controller. So I already created a preview view controller. It just has an image view, and it sets its preferred content size to the size of the image that you pass in. And that tells the system the ratio of the preview. So the ratio of our preview will match the ratio of the photo itself. If you wanted to, you could just make it square and clip the photo, but I like showing the whole photo. So here we'll just return a recipe preview view controller and pass in the recipe's photo. And let's see what that animation looks like. Nice, look at that big French toast. Looks pretty tasty. Now, this is really nice. The preview is a lot better, but there's actually a bit of polish you can do here. If you'll notice, the image is animating just from the cell itself. And I think it would be really cool if this little thumbnail sort of expanded. And there is actually a method to do that. Let's go ahead and go to our next step just to make sure everything's in a good state. And we're going to try and polish this preview animation using a class called UI targeted preview. And it's not super well documented, but I was digging into it over the summer, and it's pretty cool. It lets you return a preview with a target. Basically, it's just an image, or sorry, a view and a location. And let's take a look at how we can do that. So if I target for, sorry, preview for highlighting, let's find it here. Yep. So this method, preview for highlighting context menu with configuration, lets us return a UI targeted preview. And let's take a look at what it takes to build one of those. There's a really simple initializer with just a view. So let's go ahead and do that. But first we'll need to get the view we want to preview. So let's get the index for our menu for the item currently open. And with our little extension, that's easy. If we can't get the index, well, we're not going to create a preview. And then we actually need a reference to the photo view itself. That's the view we want to use for our highlight preview. So if we go to our cell, it's private, and I don't actually want to expose this to I don't want anyone else to be able to set an image on this image view. So we'll just provide a little extension of our highlight view. You can maybe put this in a protocol if you were writing a lot of these menus. And that'll be our photo view. All right, so going back here, we also need to get the cell itself. So we can use the table view, cell for row at, and we'll create a quick index path since we know there's only one section. Sorry. The index is our row. Else return. And now we have our cell. Let's cast it as a recipe cell. And now we can use that highlight view. And if we go ahead and run this, missing return, yep, return that preview. You'll notice the preview sort of highlights that. It bounces the image view and then expands from there. So that's pretty neat. I think it adds a lot of polish if you're going to add these menus. So let me skip ahead, because you'll notice that on dismiss, it's still just fading back into the cell. I'm not going to bore you with writing all that again, but if you implement preview for dismissing context menu with configuration and return the same sort of preview, I put that in a helper method, then I'll get the same animation expanding, and the photo will go back right into that image when you dismiss it. There it is. All right. Yeah, thanks. So lastly, let's go ahead and add drag integration so that if the user starts previewing this, they can change their mind and just drag that preview instead of having to dismiss it. Let's do this on an iPad. See what it looks like now. All right. So we're messaging John Appleseed about dinner, of course. And we could drag one of these over, maybe, tricky on a touchpad, and drop it in here. But let's say we have the menu open. Well, thanks to the fine UI kit people at Apple, the interaction happens automatically. We actually don't have to do anything. Just by using the native drag and drop APIs and the UI context menu interaction, we get drag and drop for free. So that's pretty cool. There's one more thing I want to talk about, or a few little polish items that you can use that I couldn't fit in here. So I have another tab completely unrelated to recipes. Let's go back to our iPhone. And I map out all the Lyft office locations in San Francisco. I think we're the only one. And if you tap on that annotation on the map, you'll see it shows a little preview of the office and shows the address. And let's take a look at how that's implemented. That's all right in MapViewController. It doesn't do too much. Don't look at my MapView code too much. I don't use MapKit that much, but it sets up some annotations, returns a custom annotation view. When you select one, it shows the details. When you deselect one, it hides the details. So let's go ahead and collapse that. We want to add a context menu to this, and it's not a table view or collection view. So in this case, we have to actually set up the context menu interaction ourselves. And it's pretty similar if you've used drag and drop, pretty similar API to that. First, you create a UI context menu interaction. So we'll go ahead and create one of those guys, and it's needs a delegate. So we're going to conform self to that protocol in a minute. So we'll go ahead and pass in self, and then we need to add that interaction to a view, and we'll just go ahead and add it to our view controllers view. You could maybe create an interaction for every annotation view on your map and add the interaction to that view, but it seems a lot more efficient to just add it to our own view. And we can actually look up the annotation at a location, because if you recall, the method passes in a location, a point. So let's look at that. If we conform to UI context menu interaction delegate, we're already done with step 1, set up the interaction. Step 2, create a menu configuration. And this is just like before. But we need to check that the interaction is occurring on an annotation. Otherwise, we don't return a configuration and no menu will pop up. So it's actually complaining because we're not implementing that configuration method. So if we go ahead and implement that and always return nil, you'll notice that even though we set up an interaction, long pressing on our map does nothing. Trust me, I'm long pressing. And that's because we're not returning a configuration. So you get to choose when a menu shows up, even if you add the interaction to a larger view. So let's check first that there's an annotation view where we're pressing. So guard annotation view equal, and there's a really handy method on UI view that lets us test what view is under a hit test. So we want to check at this location that the menu passed in. We don't have an event to pass. And if there's no annotation view there, we'll return null. Sorry, we need to cast it, of course, as an office annotation view. If there's no office annotation view there, we'll return no menu. And from here, we can get the annotation for this view, because MK annotation view, which this subclass is, has an annotation property. So once again, guard the annotation, call annotation view dot annotation as a location. Location is the MK annotation that I've created to show this item. Else return nil. And now that we have our annotation, we can build a menu that performs actions on it. I won't bore you with building another menu, so let's skip ahead. Yeah, we've got our annotation, and we're returning a menu. So if we go ahead and run this, it's a pretty similar menu. We have a favorite option and a share option. If I press here, nothing happens. Press here, that's not super pretty. So UI context menu interactions by default will preview the view that the interaction is on. And that's the view controller's view. And it's clearly messing with the hierarchy a bit. It's kind of doing wonky stuff. So to handle that, let's make a highlight preview like we did before. We don't want to actually preview a view controller, but we're going to provide a highlight preview for the system to use. So that's pretty similar. UI targeted preview. But we're going to use a view that's not already in the view hierarchy. So let's create a view for that. And I called it Office Preview View. If we take a look at that class, it's got an image view and a circle view for showing a circle of the Office image above, and then a little pink dot underneath, just like this annotation has. And it rounds those views. It sets the background color to clear, so we just have those two circles. And let's create a UI targeted preview with this. Oh, sorry. We need to look up that image from the annotation. We're already passing in the annotation's menu ID. So let's get that annotation. Item. For configuration. Same protocol as before, comes in pretty handy. And now we can pass in that location's, call the annotation, that annotation's photo. And now we return a UI targeted preview just like before. But if you'll notice, this initializer says it creates a targeted preview for a view already in the window. And we just created this view, and it's not in the view hierarchy. So let's take a look at this one. Also for a view in the current window. But this preview initializer doesn't specify the view has to be in the current window. So that seems like the right one. So we'll pass in our preview view. And UI preview parameters, who knows what that is. Let's just ignore that for now by constructing some default ones. And a UI preview target. So the system doesn't need a UI preview target if you're already in the view hierarchy. But if you aren't, sorry, this is so small, it's basically just an object to specify a container view for your view for this animation. So let's create a UI preview target. All we need is a container view, and we can just use our view controller's view for that, and a location for our preview to basically be targeted at. And if you'll notice, it passes in the interaction here. We can actually use the interaction's location in view to look up where the interaction is occurring and create a target there. So if we build this, we should see a pretty nice preview view when we force touch here. Oh, what are we doing wrong? Preview for dismissing. We actually want preview for highlighting. Wrong view. All right, and there it is. Oh man, it's so slow on the simulator. Let's go again. Well, that's kind of weird. We have a white background, even though we set our view's color to clear. That's actually something the system is doing. So let's see if we can get rid of that. Let's take a look at those parameters. If we create some of those UI preview parameters and look at the properties, you'll notice there's a background color. We could try setting that to dot clear. That actually wouldn't work either, because UIKit is still going to sort of highlight this shape here for the preview. So let's look at what else there is. Visible path, that seems useful. So this property actually lets you customize the shape of your preview. By default, it'll do this nice rounded corner thingy, which works pretty nice in most cases. But we actually want a more complicated path where it's just this circle and this little circle. I've gone ahead and already implemented that in our preview view. And all it does is create a Bezier path around your image view, around the circle view, an oval, appends them, and returns it. So let's go ahead and get rid of these corner radii, just so we don't run into any masking issues. And we'll go ahead and do visible path equals preview view dot make visible path. Let's make sure to pass in those params. And we're already on step 4 here, actually. All right, let it load in. Should be a little less laggy. And there it is, our custom shape. So almost done, but let's see. So sorry, let me skip ahead here. So now we've got our preview all set up. But we want to show the detail when you tap on this preview. Right now, nothing happens. So let's again implement, we'll perform preview action. And instead of presenting anything here, we're going to get that location and tell the map view to select it. And that should show our little detail view when we tap the preview. All right, but it's still a little off. Like, it has this really big pop animation, and you sort of expect the whole screen to be changing, like, here's this new thing. So there's one more thing we can do to polish it up just a bit. And that's enabled with this Animator. There's actually a property on here called preferred commit style. And the commit is what happens when you tap on the preview and commit to seeing what the preview will reveal. And we can actually set it to .pop, which is the default, or dismiss. And if we use dismiss, it'll just sort of fade the menu away like it does when you tap on an item. And I think that'll look a lot better if we open up the menu, tap on it. Now it just sort of fades back. Our card pops up. It all looks pretty good. And that's all the live coding I have. But I've got a few more slides. Let me get this set up. Let's talk really quickly about Catalyst. It's the new framework by Apple, Mac Catalyst, to run your iOS apps on Mac. And I would love to live code this, but IT hasn't approved Catalina on our MacBooks yet. But I ran it on my computer at home. And for the most part, the context menus just work. You can right-click on a row. Your menu shows up. There's no previews, and there's no images, unfortunately, in your items. But you'll notice there's this really tiny highlight. I don't know if you can see it around the image view. And that's because we're specifying a UI preview target for that image, for that view. And that doesn't really look great. I mean, it's hard to tell which item you've right-clicked on right here, I think. So you might want to check if your target environment is Mac Catalyst. And in that case, in your configuration for making the preview, just return null, and the system will highlight the entire cell by default. And there you go. Now you can tell which item is being highlighted. So to quickly recap, adding menus to your view, the basics are simple. You just add an interaction to your view and build up your menu using UI context menu configuration. Make sure you're not using index paths as IDs. But there's a whole lot you can do to polish it up after that. You can use nested UI menu objects for your submenus. Add custom previews with PreviewProvider. Maybe not on macOS. Polish your preview animations with UI targeted preview. There's a lot more you can do with that. Customize your targeted preview with preview parameters. Polish up your commit animations with the preferred commit style. And with that, I'll set my own commit style to dismiss, because that's all I've got. Here's some resources. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. This GitHub repo /recipes has the whole demo app that I demoed up here. And my website has a context menu guide on there, which has even more details, maybe not too many more, similar to this talk. And of course, check out the developer documentation and interface guidelines. Thanks.
Great job, Kyle. Let's take 3 questions, and then we can chat with the speakers.
Hey, this is going to be a really simple question. So if I remember correctly, Apple announced that they are discontinuing 3D touch. So if I was to implement this in my app, would it become forwards compatible with like long press?
Yeah, that's a great question. They are removing the 3D touch hardware. The iPhone 11 doesn't have it. But the great thing about this API is it'll work with long press or 3D touch. So on iPads, you can now have these great menus and previews. And on older devices and super new devices, you'll get all the same functionality. Yeah.
Next question.
Do you have an experience with the Swift UI equivalent of this? I'm just curious how you think with the APIs, if it's better or worse.
That's a great question. I have not dug into Swift UI, unfortunately. Is there an API in it for in Swift UI?
Yeah, it's something similar. Yeah, it's something similar to just where with you have like a navigation item, you just encapsulate what you want to show. You do the same thing with like .context menu, but I don't have that much experience outside of reading the documentation myself.
Good to know. Yeah, I should definitely update my blog post with that. That seems useful. I'll look into it.
Any other questions that Kyle actually knows the answers to?
That's harsh, JP, but it's fair. It's fair.
I'm harsh because I love you, Kyle. All right, give it up for Kyle.